British motorsport first saw Senna involved in intense competition in 1983. His rivalry with the young Martin Brundle making the British Formula 3 Championship that year a classic. Brundle went well in the second half of the season, but Senna had dominated the first half with a record 9 straight wins.
Ayrton's a bit of an exception. If he hadn't have been here this year, I'd be looking rather good at the moment, having won 7 or 8 races.
Lap 15 completed into lap 16, and the monotonously, almost boringly successful Ayrton Senna from Brazil is, as we are used to seeing him, very much in the lead on this, the 16th lap in the 20-lap Formula 3 Championship round 5, and struggling along in his wake as ever, very successfully but not successfully enough, is the ever hard-trying Martin Brundle in the blue Eddie Jordan wrought Toyota. There he is.
I learned from the Formula 3 days, particularly the colour of his crash helmet was very bright colour scheme. And he took no prisoners whatsoever. You could clearly see him coming up behind you, and he very often left you to decide whether or not you were going to have an accident with him. He put his car in a position to overtake you, and it happened to me in Formula 3 many times, and we did have many accidents because I wouldn't let him through.
And when he came to us, Martin was one of those drivers who needed a degree of help in terms of, he always kept telling himself, and we kept telling him, Martin, you can take him. At this stage, obviously, no one realised how good that Senna was going to be. So it was easier to accept it. There was no, if you like, big reputation about it. Here was just another Brazilian who was obviously going to be good, but not to the level that we now know.
A significant day, Senna's first drive in a Formula 1 car, courtesy of Williams, Donington, 1983. Other tests would follow with Tolman, Brabham and McLaren, but this moment was special.
We'd run a lot there with the car that year with our regular drivers, and on lap 11, his first time out in a Grand Prix car, he equalled the best time that car had done in other hands, and on lap 23 he was about a second a lap faster than the car had gone. At that point he came in, stopped and said, I think I've had enough today, I want to go home and think about what I've done, and left.
We were both invited to test a Formula 1 car for McLaren. A magnificent event. It was McLaren number 8, which ironically 10 years later I would race in Formula 1. He drove first, and Stefan Beloff was also there. Sadly, they're both dead now, and myself. And I'll never forget Senna screaming past the pits, blue smoke pouring out of the back. I stood beside Ron Dennis at the time, although he wouldn't know or remember. And Senna just kept his foot in until he passed the point where it was being timing, jumped out and wanted to know what the lap time was because he felt it was his best lap. I very clearly remember Ron Dennis saying, I find it very difficult to press a stopwatch when my car is in flames and pouring smoke out the back. Ayrton. But somehow they put another engine in it, and Ayrton negotiated a second go in the car because we'd all done very, very similar lap times, and of course he went significantly faster with the second opportunity. And it always impressed me how he, at such an early age, had that kind of head on him, that kind of maturity to know what the right thing to do was.
An early marriage was sacrificed to his racing ambitions, and as these progressed, the total support of his parents remained. Through Formula 3, Formula 1 and on to the World Championship title itself, his family and his country remained paramount in his mind. Even in the karting days, the yellow helmet and indeed the driving style were easy to spot, and he was keen that the Brazilian flag should become as familiar on the race circuits and television screens of the world. Maybe even more than Pelé, he'd become Brazil's greatest sporting hero, and certainly its greatest ambassador.
Born here, and things I know, as fundamental things of life I learn here. I learn with my family, with my friends, with my teachers at school, by living day by day, experience the incredible atmosphere that Brazil has got.
I'm really a fan. I'm very excited. You know who that is? Right?
Hello everybody. Everybody have a good time. Somehow, somewhere in the world, you know, our flag goes up whenever we manage to win or do well. And that is seen by people as a positive thing, as a good thing. And I suppose that counterbalance a little bit to the social problems, the difficulties and the bad publicity that some of the problems that we have here get outside Brazil.
Inicialmente, até uma ideia que surgiu.
Initially, we thought of just giving up everything, giving up all the businesses. But then, thinking about Ayrton's wishes, he had talked about making some sort of social contribution in a more organized way than he had done before, because he used to be very discreet about it. So we decided to continue all the projects that had already been started and to use his image to help people, even after his death, just as he had helped people before, especially in Brazil, just by being himself through his values and attitudes. Ayrton was a person who cared very much about quality, organization, and doing things in the best way possible. That's why he had the idea of setting up an institution, and the logical thing to do was to set up a foundation.
Então, a lógica foi fazer uma fundação.
In 1988, the partnership between Senna and Ron Dennis at McLaren had begun. Lotus had given him pole positions and victories, but McLaren gave him a championship chance, and that year he'd take it after an acrimonious battle with teammate Alain Prost. And Ayrton was equally determined to establish himself among the highest earners in the sport. When it came to contract negotiations, he was a determined opponent for Ron Dennis, who can claim at least one victory.
He was incredibly tough, even in those early days. In the end, we just came to a complete stalemate over the last $500,000. So I suggested that we actually flicked a coin for the $500,000. He didn't even understand what that meant, and on having it explained that this was just purely the simplest way to break the deadlock, I then had to draw pictures of a head and a tail to be absolutely sure that there was no doubt as to the interpretation. And so we literally wrote on a piece of paper the rules of this very simple thing, because he still didn't have a complete command of the English language. And I won the toss, as it were, which he never ever forgave me for, and I paid 1,000,000 times for that. I owe 1,000,000 times. It was only about 10 days later that it suddenly dawned on him that in fact it wasn't $500,000, it was in fact $1.5 million, because it was a 3-year contract.
I have had all my life a very, very strong and good education. And from that education I have got, again, clear and strong principles in way of behaving. And that's where I'm guided for. I use those lines and those guidelines to move as a man, as a professional. And I don't regret anything. I just feel I'm doing things for the right reason. Some understand, some don't. In the end, you never get everybody to understand and to agree and to accept. But most of them, I'm sure, admire, after all, what I'm doing. as a professional and as a man, and as many drivers do. We are exposing our lives there consistent, and the reason for it is only one: is to succeed, is to win, is to get the thrill when you cross the finish line in first place.
When you're in a racing car, there is nothing allowed. You don't hear the crowd, you don't see them in the same way as a tennis player, a golf player, and an athlete or anybody else does. And it's a magic carpet.
It isn't just the speed of thought, it is the anticipation of what's coming. I mean, when you come into a corner, you've got to know what you're going to do. You don't drive a corner round the corner, you drive a corner before you get there. In other words, you set the car up, you say, look, this is what we're going to do, and then you compensate on the throttle, and you compensate through the steering, but to a relatively small amount. You have got to come in knowing what you're going to do. You've got to be programmed. And I think that he had the finest chip going, and it was just programmed. Every corner he come into, he had the darn thing programmed, and yet, if he had to make a decision in the middle of it, he had the talent to be able to throw the car from one position to another and catch it and hold it and control it.
He seemed to be talking about, well, the road just does this a little bit here in the corner, and then there's a bit that drops away there. And when he described the car, he was describing the contours of the road in every minute detail, and the way the car behaved.
The worst is the second chicane and in the third chicane. But it's because the asphalt goes like this, in the third chicane, and it's like this. In the second chicane is becoming bumpy, and then it's like you go against the ground basically, and the car is really down. You get low grip. It's tough.
And it must have been, to him, like everything was much. It was a sort of slow. It seemed like it was recording in slow motion, and that was fascinating to listen to.
Although I spent 6 years racing against Ayrton in Formula One, it really wasn't until I joined McLaren as a test driver in 1990 that I had the chance to see exactly how fast he was and exactly how he did it. Now, in those days, we go to a European circuit like Monza or Estoril for a 3-day test, and normally I do the first day or two pounding around, getting down to what I thought was a very respectable time before Senna came along, and within 10 laps he would have been a second faster. So how did he do it? Looking at the pictures, it's hard to see. But if we look at data recordings showing just how the driver is using the controls, examples of Senna's technique can be seen. Looking first at braking into a corner, the blue line shows me braking. Compare this with the red line of Ayrton, clearly showing that here he doesn't brake as hard or for as long. The result is that he's going faster into the corner. On acceleration out of the corner, Senna's unique technique is equally obvious. Whereas I would progressively increase the throttle opening, Ayrton would immediately start stabbing at it, pushing to get his foot hard down earlier, and therefore exit faster too. Putting both of these together means that with this example he pulls out 0.2 of a second through this section alone, and that's just one small part of the whole lap.
But where he was, let's say, mercurial in his driving was that he had the ability, from the moment the light went to green, to be on the pace instantly. A number of drivers tend to take the first lap, let's say, a little bit cautiously, because they haven't got the tyre temperatures maybe up to their full operating temperature. The car's been sitting in the grid for a short period. The tyre pressures likewise. So there's a tendency for drivers to be just that little bit cautious to make sure that the feelings that they have got give them confidence. Senna didn't need that. He was able to go 100% on the opening lap. And if you can do that and open an advantage in the early laps, it demoralizes your opponents, and it gives you then that little bit of barrier between yourself and the cars following. And I think the best example I saw of that, certainly in recent years, was at last year's European Grand Prix at Donington Park.